Okay, on the second day of review in class, this is notes that we did together to prepare for the test. So the first one wants us to write the equation of the parabola in vertex form. Now remember, vertex form is y equals a times x minus h squared plus k. So h and k represent the vertex, and this point represents x and y. To be able to write it in vertex form, you got to know what a is. That's what's missing. So to start, we're going to plug in all the numbers that we know and solve for what we don't know. So y is -1 equals a, that's what we're trying to solve for. X is 5 minus h is 3 squared plus k is -2. So the first thing we need to do is simplify in the parentheses. Well, 5 minus 3 is 2, but that number is going to get squared, so it's really 4. Now, most of the time, we do not write a4. So write it what makes sense. Write 4a minus 2. Okay, to get a by itself, we're going to add 2 to both sides, so we get 1 equals 4a. To finish this, we're going to divide by 4, so a equals 1/4. Now that we do that, we can write the equation. When you write the equation, the y and x stay y and x. You're going to put in numbers for a, h, and k. And now we know those numbers. So y stays. A we now know is 1/4. X stays. Minus h you know is 3. Squared plus k. So plus -2, which is just -2. All right. Number 2. Write the equation of the parabola in standard form that passes through these 3 points. And notice it says use quadratic regression on your calculator. So this is a calculator problem. So let's go to our calculator and see what we can do. Let's first make sure that our calculator is set correctly. So to do that, we do second plus sign 712, second plus sign 712, and then everything is clear. Now, to do these problems, we adjusted the mode. We didn't want it to float and just keep rounding. We wanted it to round to the nearest 2 decimals. So we move the float over to 2 and hit enter. Now that we've done that, we can get out of that menu by hitting second quit. All right, we want to find the equation using quadratic regression. To get there, you need to hit the stat button. We're in edit, that's where we want to put the information in, and we want to go to list 1. In list 1, we're going to put our x's, which would be 2, 3, and 6. In list 2, we are going to write the y's and write them in line with the x they match. So 2 went with -8, 3 went with -8 as well, and 6 went with 4. Notice it's rounding everything to 2 decimal places, which we told the calculator to do. All right, so now I go back to my stat menu. I want it to calculate. I want it to calculate quadratic regression, which is option 5. The x list is in list 1. The y list is in list 2. And now we need to go to store the regular equation. To do that, we're going to hit the variables button, go over to the y variables. We want a function, and we want y1. Then we're going to go down here and hit calculate. So what it gave us is that A is 1, B is -5, and C is -2. Notice also up here that it gives you the equation for standard form. All right, let's put those numbers in. So A was -1, just kidding, +1. Can't read my own handwriting. A was 1, B is -5, and C is -2. So our equation is going to be y equals, and it would be ax squared. Well, if a is 1, you don't have to write the 1x squared, minus 5x minus 2. There's our equation. Now I'm going to go back to my calculator. If you are able to tell the calculator to put the graph in, the graph should be in the y equals for you. If it is not in the y equals for you, you need to clear out anything that's there and put the equation in. And now we need to graph it. Well, all the points I gave you are all less than 10, so a standard window would probably be the best. So I'm going to go to Zoom 6, and I'm going to look at my graph. And there it is. It opens up, which makes sense because x squared is positive. All right, so now my vertex is at the bottom. So my vertex is a minimum, and I need to calculate what that minimum value is. So on my calculator, I'm hit second, calculate, and I want the minimum value, which is 3. So I'm going to move my cursor over where it's clearly on the left and hit enter. Then I'm going to move my cursor over so it's clearly to the right and hit enter. Then I'm going to enter a third time, and it's going to tell you that the minimum is 2.5, negative 8.25. If I were to write that, that is the coordinates of the vertex. But if I want the maximum or minimum, I'm only recording the y value, which is negative 8.25. All right, let's try this again. Use quadratic regression to write the equation in the parabola in standard form. So quadratic regression, that is all on your calculator. So let's go back to our calculator, go to the stat menu, we want to edit, but now there's information in there and we don't want it. So we're going to go up to L1, hit clear and down arrow, then we're going to go over L2, clear and down arrow, and it's all empty. In L1, we are going to put the x's, which would be 0 and 2 and 4 and 6. In the L2, we're going to put the y's that match with those. 9.2, 12.7, 23.9, and 15.8. And hit, whoa, that's totally wrong. Fix that. Now remember what I told you. Good advice is before you go any further and leave this screen, go back and double check your answers. That one little typo would have given me completely wrong answers, even though I know what I'm doing. Okay, now I go to the stat menu. I want to go to calculate. I want quadratic regression, which is 5. L1 is x's, L2 is y's. I'm going to store my equation. So I'm going to go to the variables, y variables, function, y1, and now I go down to calculate. And when I do this, it gives me A is negative 0.73, B is 5.90, and C is 7.85. Now that I know this, I can write my equation. So my equation is going to be y equals, notice, I keep writing the y equals, that's an important part, negative 0.73x squared plus 5.9x plus 7.85. Now it says it wants us to calculate the maximum value. Well, this graph starts with a negative, so wouldn't it open up? Open down, so wouldn't the vertex be the maximum value? All right, let's check it out. Let's calculate what it is. So we're going to go to our calculator. Because I asked it to, it's in that y1. But again, if your equation is not there, enter it by hand, and you can still do the same thing. Now, going to a 10 by 10 may not help, because some of my y values, if you look, my x's go from 0 to 6. So 0 to 10 on x might be totally reasonable, but my y values, I mean, they're down low, but they go all the way up to 23, so I need something bigger than that. So I'm going to try changing my window. I don't really need any negative x values. Whoops, I did the wrong one. So I'm going to change that to 0. My x maximum, I'm going to keep the same because it went up to 6, so 10 is totally reasonable. Counting by 1 is totally reasonable. The y's, we had no negative ones, but the highest one we had was 23.9, so I want something bigger than that. Let's try 25. And counting by 1 is fine, so let's see what happens. I'm going to graph it. And look, there's my parabola. It opens down, so I need to calculate the maximum value. So I have second, calculate. I need maximum, which is 4. And I'll go over to the left and hit enter. And then I'll go over about the same distance from the center on the other side and hit enter. And there's my guess. And it tells me the maximum is 4.04 and 19.77. So this is the ordered pair of the vertex. This is the vertex of the graph. However, if we want a maximum value, we only want the y value, which is 19.77. Okay, number 4, solve by completing the square. So to do that, the first step is to move the negative 12 over. So I have negative 12 plus blank equals. I cannot complete the square when this leading coefficient is anything other than invisible positive 1. So I'm going to take out the negative 2, leaving me with x squared minus 4x, because 8 divided by negative 2 is negative 4, plus blank. To get the number that goes here, I'm going to take negative 4 and divide by 2, which is negative 2. Then I'm going to square the negative 2, which is positive 4, and that's the number that goes back here. Okay, but I'm not going to put 4 on the other side because I didn't really add negative 4. I added negative 2 times 4, which would be negative 8. So when I simplify this, negative 12 and negative 8 is negative 20 equals negative 2, and now I'm going to factor that. The two numbers that multiply to 4 and add to negative 4 would be negative 2 and negative 2. So instead of writing it like this, because what I'm really doing is factoring, I just write it one time and write it x minus 2 squared. That's what we're doing here, is factoring that part. But remember, half of negative 4 is negative 2, so you don't have to work that hard to factor. Now I need to divide both sides by negative 2 because I can't take the square root till the parentheses by itself. So now I get 10 equals x minus 2 squared. To finish it off, I'm going to take the square root. Squaring and the square root cancel each other, so I get x minus 2. On the left, anytime I take the square root of a number, I get positive and negative. Now I'm going to check. I can break it down, but there's no pairs, so the square root of 10 won't simplify, and I don't add an I because it's not negative. So to finish it, I'll add 2 to both sides. So x is going to equal 2 plus the square root of 10 and 2 minus the square root of 10. Okay, this one, we're still completing the square. It's really important you read the directions on these because they're going to tell you what to do on each part. So again, to complete the square, I'm going to move that 5 over, but I have the y with it now. So I'm going to have y plus 5 equals. I cannot click, oops, forgot my plus blank. I cannot complete the square until I have a positive 1 there. So I'm going to factor out a positive 3, leaving me with x squared, 6 divided by 3, so I have 2x plus blank. To fill in this number here, I'm going to take 2 divided by 2, which is 1, and then I'm going to square 1, which is 1. Okay, but I didn't add just 1, I added 3 times 1, so that's how I get the 3 there. So to simplify it, 5 plus 3 is 8. Equals 3, and now I need to factor that. The two numbers that multiply to 1 and add to 2 would be x plus 1 and x plus 1, but we don't write it out twice because that's not the form we're looking for. We write it like this. Now to get y by itself, I'm going to subtract 8 from both sides. So the equation in vertex form is y equals 3 times x plus 1 squared minus 8. And remember, vertex form from the first side, y equals a times x minus h squared minus k, or plus k. Isn't that what we have there? Yes, we are successful. Okay, number 6, quadratic formula. You've got to read the directions. So this is a, b, and c. The opposite of b would be negative 4 plus or minus the square root of b squared, which is 16, plus negative 4 times a, which is 2, times c, which is 11, all over 2 times a, which is 2. So the first step is to simplify under the parentheses. So over here, negative 4 times 2 is negative 8. Negative 8 times 11 would be, whoops, that's not where we wanted to go. Negative 8 times 11 would be negative 88, and then plus 16, so you're really subtracting the 2, would give you 72. All over 4. Now it's at this point we're going to split it, but we have to simplify the radical. So 72, well, that's 2 and 36, 6 and 6, 2 and 3, 3 and 2. So here's a pair, here's a pair. So 2 times 3, 2 underneath. So it's going to be negative 4 plus 6 square root 2 over 4, and negative 4 minus 6 square root 2 over 4. Now, I do not start simplifying until I've split it. Now that I've split it, now I can simplify. All right, so I'm going to look not with the radical, but the other 3, the 4 and the 6. Is there a number I can go into, both of them? Are all three of them? Yes. And so my final answer is going to be negative 2 plus 3 square root 2 over 2 and negative 2 minus 3 square root 2 over 2. And that is my final answer. All right, solve by factoring. So solve by factoring, you just have to set it equal to 0. You have to factor, and then you have to solve. So this first one is not equal to 0, so I'm going to subtract 25 from both sides. So I get x squared minus 25 equals 0. Well, it's a binomial. I can take the square root of both. The square root of x squared is x. Square root of 25 is 5. One's plus, one's minus. I do not need an I because what I was factoring is a minus. So this gives me x equals negative 5, and this one gives me x equals positive 5. And I'm done. Number 8. Got to set it equal to 0. So I'm going to add 49 to both sides. Now I need to factor. Well, it's a binomial. I can take the square root of both. So I'm going to go straight to my two parentheses. The square root of 9x squared is 3x. Square root of 49 is 7. One's plus, one's minus. But because what I was factoring was plus, I have to add the I. So when I solve this one, I'm going to subtract 7i and divide by 3. So I have negative 7i over 3. Here I'd add 7i and divide by 3. So I have positive 7i over 3. Okay, number 9. To solve that, it's already set equal to 0. So I'm going to go factor. It's a binomial, but I cannot take the square root of everything. So I have to look for a greatest common factor. And on this one, the greatest common factor is 2. So I'm going to take out the 2, and I'm left with x squared minus 16 equals 0. Now inside the parentheses, that I can factor. Now it's a binomial, and I can take the square root of everything. So I'm going to go straight to my two parentheses, and the square root of x squared is x. The square root of 16 is 4. One's plus, one's minus. I do not write an I because what I'm factoring is negative. The 2 does not give me a solution. This gives me negative 4, and this gives me positive 4, and I'm done. Okay, number 10. First we have to set it equal to 0. I got to move that 3x over, and when I do that, I have to have x squared x and then in the number. So it's going to be x squared minus 3x minus 108 equals 0. Go straight to my two parentheses because it's a trinomial. I know I will not have an I because you cannot have an I with a trinomial. Okay, so I have an x and an x. Now I need two numbers that multiply to negative 108 and add to 3. Okay, this is a tricky one, but with a little guess and check on your calculator, you can keep dividing a couple things. We know they have to be opposite signs because it multiplies to a negative. We know the bigger one has to be negative because it adds to a negative. So I'm going to say what it comes out to be is x is 12 and 9. They add to negative 3, and if they multiply to 108. So this gives me x equals 12, and this gives me x equals negative 9. Last one. It's already set equal to 0, but we don't know how to factor. Take that back. We haven't reviewed factoring anything with the leading coefficient not x squared. So that's a big red flag that I'm going to have another greatest common factor, which in this case is 2. So I'm going to take out the 2, and I'm going to have x squared minus 15x. 112 divided by 2 would be 56 equals 0. Now inside the parentheses I have a trinomial, so I'm going to go straight to my two parentheses. I'm going to have an x and an x. The two numbers that multiply to 56 and add to 15. Well, if it multiplies to a positive, they have to add the same sign. And if they add to a negative, they both have to be negative. So you can try a bunch of them, but what about 8 and 7? Does that work? Sure does. So x equals 8 and x equals 7. And we're done.